He found her in the barn, at first light, holding his sick child against her chest. Cole Merritt had come out with a rifle and a hard heart. He left with neither. The woman was a stranger, ragged, half frozen. She had no business being on his land in his barn, breathing warmth into a little girl who hadn't smiled in 6 days. But Lily was smiling now, and that changed everything. Drop your city in the comments and stay with me until the end. This story is for every soul who ever believed they were only worth something when they were useful to somebody else. The snow had been falling since Tuesday. By Thursday night, it was no longer snow. It was a verdict. It came sideways off the Montana plains hard as buckshot, and it did not care about the women and children caught in its path. It did not care about thin coats or worn-through boot soles, or the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single hard day, but from 100 hard days laid end to end like stones across a riverbed. Nora Ashby had been walking in it for 2 hours. She did not know exactly where she was going. She knew only that she could not go back. Behind her, in the yellow lamplight of a boarding house window she would never see again, Edgar Holst had counted out her late husband's debts on the kitchen table, like a man laying out a hand of cards. Every coin accounted for. Every favor tallied. He had smiled when he told her the number, because men like Edgar Holst always smiled when the number was too large to be paid. "You got till morning," he had said. "Then I take the rooms and everything in them." She had taken only what she could carry, a canvas bag, one change of dress, her mother's small Bible, its cover soft and cracked as old leather, a single photograph of a man she had loved and buried inside of 14 months of marriage, a man who had left her nothing but his name and his debts, and a silence so large she sometimes felt she was living inside of it. Thomas Ashby had not been a bad man. He had been a weak one. There was a difference, and Nora had spent 3 years learning it. The cold reached inside her coat, now past the wool, past the thin cotton of her dress, and pressed itself flat against her ribs. Her feet had stopped hurting somewhere back on the main road. That was not a good sign. She had grown up on a farm, and she knew what it meant when a part of you stopped reporting in. She kept walking. The town of Harlan, Montana, had turned its back on her with remarkable efficiency. She had cooked for the First Presbyterian supper table every Friday for 2 years. She had brought pots of soup to sick neighbors, had mended the altar cloth when it tore, had given more than she had to give because giving was the only currency she possessed, and she had spent it freely believing, the way a child believes that the account would be honored when she needed it. It had not been honored. When Thomas's debts became known, the women of Harlan looked at her the way they looked at mud tracked across a clean floor. Mrs. Caldwell, who had eaten Nora's bread and praised it to heaven, crossed the street rather than speak to her. Reverend Marsh said he would pray for her situation. He did not offer a room. He did not offer a meal. He offered prayer, which costs a man nothing and warms no one. So Nora walked. She thought of warmth the way a person thinks of a word, in another language, knowing what it means, but unable to feel it in her mouth. She thought of the kitchen of her girlhood, her mother standing at the big iron stove, the smell of salt pork and onions, the particular happiness of a room that smelled like food and fire and someone who loved you. She had been trying to recreate that room her entire adult life. In boarding houses and church halls, and the sad little kitchen of the apartment she had shared with Thomas, she had cooked and cleaned and arranged things just so, believing that if she made the space warm enough, safe enough, good enough, it would keep the coldness of the world from getting in. The coldness had always gotten in anyway. Her left foot went into a drift up to her knee. She hauled it out. The boot made a sound like a small cry. She was crying too, she realized. She had not noticed when it started. The tears were warm on her face for a moment, and then they were not. Ahead of her, through the curtain of snow, she saw a light. It was faint and far. It could have been a farmhouse or a trick of the weather. It did not matter. It was the only light there was, and Nora Ashby had learned long ago that you move toward the only light available, and you ask questions later. She moved toward it. It took another half hour. The snow was deep in the fields, and she broke trail through it step by step, her breath coming in hard white clouds. At some point she began to talk to herself, not words exactly, just a low, continuous murmur, the kind of sound you make to a frightened animal to let it know you are still there. She was talking to herself the way she might talk to a horse. Steady now. Keep on. Just keep on. The light resolved itself into a window. Behind the window, a house. Beside the house, a barn. The barn was large and solid, and the smell of hay and horse reached her even through the cold. She stood at the edge of the property for a long moment. The house was lit. Someone was awake. She could see a shadow moving behind the curtain, the restless back and forth of a person who could not settle. She thought about knocking on the door. She rehearsed it in her mind the way you rehearse a thing you are afraid of. "Good evening. I am sorry to trouble you. I wonder if you might." And then what? She had no money. She had no claim on these people. She was a woman alone in a snowstorm, and she knew exactly how that looked, and she could not bear to see it reflected back at her in a stranger's face. She could not ask. She had never learned how. What she could do was work. What she could do was make herself useful. If she could find a corner of that barn, a few hours out of the wind, she could be gone before anyone woke. She would leave no trace. She would owe nothing and be owed nothing. And that was a kind of dignity, the only kind she had left. The barn door was not locked. She slipped inside. The warmth hit her like a hand against the chest. It was animal warmth, deep and thick, the warmth of large breathing bodies in an enclosed space. She stood in the dark for a moment and just breathed it in. 2 horses moved in their stalls. One of them turned its head and regarded her with one large dark eye, unhurried, unafraid. "Hush me. Hush," she whispered. "I am not here." She found a corner behind a stack of hay bales, sheltered from the draft that came under the door. She sat down with her bag between her knees and her back against the rough plank wall, and she closed her eyes and let the warmth work on her, let it move back into her hands, and her feet the slow, burning return of sensation that was painful and welcome in equal measure. She did not mean to notice the horse, but it was hard not to. The animal in the far stall was breathing wrong. She had grown up with horses, and she knew the sound, that wet, labored pull of air that meant something was not right in the chest. She got up. She went to look. The horse was a big roan, and it was standing with its head down and its nostrils working hard, and its water bucket was frozen solid. Nora stood there for a moment, calculating the risk. Then she went to work. She found a small iron pot and a flint near the tack wall, the kind of setup a careful man kept for emergencies. She found dry wood stacked in a corner. She built the smallest fire she dared in the stone-ringed area at the center of the barn floor, sheltered on 3 sides, nothing near the hay. She had cooked over open fires since she was 6 years old. She knew how to manage a flame. She melted snow in the pot and brought the water to the roan in stages, not too fast, talking low the whole time, and she found the oats and mixed in what she thought might help. Dried chamomile from a bunch she found hanging on a nail. And she stood with the horse in the gray pre-dawn and fed it slow and watched its breathing ease. The other horse, a bay, pressed its nose over the stall rail and watched her with frank curiosity. "Don't look at me like that," she said. She had just settled back into her corner when she heard the barn door open. She did not run. Running would have been worse. She pulled herself to her feet and turned and faced it, because that was what you did. You faced it. You did not let it find you, crouched in a corner, like something ashamed of itself. The man in the doorway was large. That was the first thing. He filled the frame, the way a door fills a frame. Dark coat, dark hat, the rifle in his right hand, held easy at his side, not raised, not pointed, but there. He was not old. He was not young. He was somewhere in the hard middle years of a man who had done outdoor work all his life, and his face in the thin morning light was a face that had weathered things. He looked at her. He looked at the fire. He looked at the roan whose head was now up, whose eyes were brighter. She spoke first because waiting made it worse. "I am sorry," she said. "I will go. I meant no harm. Your horse was ailing in the night, and I could not leave it. I will go now." He did not move from the doorway. "Where?" he said. "I beg your pardon. Where you fixin' to go?" He was not asking it cruelly. His voice was flat and even, like a man asking about weather. She had no answer. She looked at him. He looked at her. "That roan's been poorly 3 days," he said finally. "I couldn't figure what to do for her." "The chest," Nora said. "She needs warmth on the chest and slow water, and the chamomile helps. I cannot say why. I have seen it help." He nodded. He did not lower the rifle, but he also did not raise it. He was looking at her the way you look at a complicated piece of machinery, trying to work out what it does and whether it can be trusted. "You been out in this storm," he said. "Yes." He took in her coat, the bag, the boots still damp. He took in all of it, and he did not look away, and he did not look disgusted. He just looked. "How long?" "Since about 10 o'clock last night." Something moved through his face too quick to name. He lowered the rifle then and leaned it against the door frame and said, "Come inside." She did not move. "I do not want charity," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his jaw shifted. "I got a little girl in that house with a fever. Been up 3 nights. I don't know the first thing about sick children." He paused. "That ain't charity. That's a trade." Nora looked at the house. She looked at the man. She picked up her bag. She had been in the kitchen for 20 minutes, moving on instinct and training and the deep bone knowledge of a woman who had cooked in a dozen different kitchens, on a dozen different stoves, when she heard the small sound from upstairs. It was not a cry. It was the sound a person makes when they are trying not to cry, that high, thin containment. She wiped her hands on her skirt and went to the stairs. The child's room was the second door. She pushed it open. Lily Merritt was 8 years old, and very small for it, and she was sitting up in her bed in the dark, with her arms wrapped around her own knees, shivering so hard, her teeth were clicking together like small stones. The window at the far end of the room had been pushed open from the inside, and the cold air was coming in. And the curtain was moving with it. And Nora understood immediately what had happened. The child had woken in the heat of fever and reached for something cold, and found the window and opened it, and now she was shivering, and confused and very far from all right. Nora crossed the room in 4 steps. She sat on the edge of the bed, and she did not ask permission, and she did not hesitate. She pulled the child against her chest and wrapped both arms around her and held her there, and she reached back with one hand and pushed the window shut against the wind. Lily stiffened for one moment. Then she went soft. Nora began to hum. It was an old song, her mother's song. She did not even choose to do it. It came out the way breath comes out without decision, because it had always been there, stored somewhere below thought. The child's shivering slowed, then it stopped. "Are you an angel?" Lily whispered. Her voice was thick with sleep and fever. "No, sweetheart," Nora said. "I am just a woman who is cold." "You smell like wood smoke." "I expect I do." "Papa burns wood smoke." "Then you must like the smell." "I do," Lily said, and her eyes closed, and within 3 minutes she was breathing in the slow, regular way of a child who has finally let go. Nora sat in the dark and held her and did not move. She did not hear Cole Merritt on the stairs. She did not hear him stop in the doorway. She did not know he was there until much later, and by then some things had already begun to shift in ways that neither of them could see. Yet the slow underground movement of things that have been frozen too long, beginning very quietly to thaw, the fever broke near dawn. Nora could tell by the way the child's skin changed under her hand from that dry, burning paper to something cooler and damp. She eased Lily back onto the pillow and pulled the quilts up and tucked them at the sides, the way her mother had always tucked them close and sure. Lily made a small sound and turned onto her side and slept on. Nora went back downstairs. Cole Merritt was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he had not drunk. He looked up when she came in. There was something terrible in his face, the particular look of a man who has been frightened to the edge of himself and is only now coming back. "Fever's broken," she said. He put the mug down. He pressed both hands flat on the table, and he stared at them, and he breathed. "Much obliged, he said at last. The words came out rough, as if they had been stored somewhere they did not quite fit. Nora moved to the stove. The fire had burned low. She stoked it and added wood and set the kettle on because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and her hands needed something to do. "She's sleeping well," she said. "I would keep her in bed today. Clear broth if she'll take it, and warm water with honey." "I don't have honey." "I saw a jar in the pantry." He was quiet a moment. "You went through my pantry. I was going to make breakfast. I am sorry. I should have asked." "No." He shook his head slowly. "No, I reckon that's fine." He looked at her again, the same measuring look as the barn, but something had changed in it. The wariness was still there, but underneath it now was something closer to wonder. "What's your name?" "Nora." "Net," she said. "Nora Ashby. Ye say Cole Merritt." He did not stand to introduce himself, which told her something about how tired he was. "You got people here?" "No." "Where were you headed last night?" She looked at the stove. "Nowhere in particular." He accepted that. Men who have spent their lives in open country learn not to push a person past what they are willing to tell. The kettle began to sing. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world through the kitchen window was white and silent and brutally beautiful, the way Montana always was the morning after a storm, when it had done its worst and sat back, looking satisfied with itself. "I can work," Nora said. "I am a capable cook. I can clean and mend and manage a household." She kept her voice even businesslike, the way you present terms to a person you need something from. "If you would allow me to stay through the winter, I would ask nothing but room and meals in return." She paused. I would not trouble you." Cole looked at her for a long time. "You already fixed my horse and broke my daughter's fever," he said. "I reckon you have earned room and meals for at least a week, just by virtue of getting through my barn door." She almost smiled. She caught it before it formed completely. "A week, then," she said. "We can discuss the rest." And he nodded. He picked up his coffee mug, looked into it, put it down again. "Lily's going to want to know who you are," he said. "When she wakes up, what would you like me to tell her?" He thought about that. He was a man she could see who thought before he spoke, who turned things over carefully before setting them down. She had not met many men like that. She was not sure what to do with the fact of him. "Tell her you're the woman who kept her warm," he said finally. "That's the truth of it, and it's enough for now." Nora turned back to the stove. Outside, a single blackbird landed on the porch railing, shook the snow from its wings, and looked in through the glass with bright and curious eyes, as if it had come to see what was beginning here, and had decided it was worth watching. She would not let herself think past the week. She had been wrong too many times before about what a place might mean, about whether a warmth was real or borrowed. She would cook breakfast. She would check on Lily. She would do the work that was in front of her, and she would not look up from it, and she would not want anything she had not been offered. She told herself this very firmly. The blackbird watched her through the glass and did not seem to believe her. Cole Merritt did not ask her to stay past the week. He did not have to. By the fourth day, the arrangement had settled into the house the way heat settles into cold stone slowly, thoroughly, until you could not tell where the cold had been. Lily was the one who decided it. She came downstairs on the morning of the third day, still pale, still moving with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been sick and knows it. And she found Nora at the stove, and stood in the doorway and watched her for a full minute without speaking. Nora felt the gaze the way you feel a window open behind you. She turned. "Good morning," she said. Lily studied her with the frank assessment that children apply to things they have not yet decided about. She had her father's eyes, that same dark measuring quality, the kind of eyes that did not look away. "Papa says you fixed Biscuit," Lily said. "The roan, yes. She's doing better. He said you knew what to do when I was sick. I helped a little." Lily considered this. "Can you make porridge?" "I can. Mama used to make it with brown sugar and a little cream." Lily said this without looking away, watching to see what Nora would do with it. Nora did not flinch. She did not offer sympathy, which children of that age often find unbearable, that careful adult tenderness that reminds them of what is gone. She just said, "I believe there is brown sugar in the pantry. I cannot promise cream, but I saw canned milk on the third shelf." Lily sat down at the kitchen table. "That will do," she said. Cole came in from the barn 20 minutes later and found his daughter sitting across from Nora, both of them bent over the table, Lily drawing something on the back of an old feed invoice with a stub of pencil, while Nora stirred a pot and watched and said, "Now and then, what is that one? Or I see, or is that a horse or a very tall dog?" And Lily responded with the slightly offended dignity of a child whose art has been misidentified. He stood in the doorway with his coat still on and the smell of cold air and hay coming off him, and he watched them, and he did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That horse looks like a dog." "It is a horse," Lily said with great feeling. "Right kind of you to clarify," he said, and he hung his coat on the peg and washed his hands at the basin and sat down. And that was how the first ordinary morning began. The work came naturally to Nora because it was the only thing that had ever come naturally to her. She was at her core a woman of useful hands. Her mother had said it first, not as a compliment or a criticism, just as a fact of observation, the way you might note that a child has good eyesight or a strong throwing arm. Nora's hands knew things her mind sometimes forgot. They knew how to work a stiff bread dough, how to tell by feel when a sauce was close to breaking, how to split and stack wood with the grain so it dried right, how to mend a seam so it held without showing. She had used those hands her whole life in service of other people's houses, other people's tables, It had given her a kind of invisible standing in Harlan, the standing of a woman who was useful, which was not the same as being valued, though she had spent a long time believing it was. Here, she found herself working not to prove her worth, but simply because the work was in front of her, and she was capable of it, and that was a different thing, though she could not have said exactly how. The house had been clean enough in the utilitarian way of a man doing his best with no particular training for it. Cole Merritt was not a negligent father. He kept Lily fed and clothed and the floors swept and the dishes washed. But the house had the feeling of a place that had lost its organizing principle, a place where someone had once known where everything belonged and why, and that knowledge had gone out of it. Nora found it coming back in gradually as she worked. She reorganized the pantry. By frequency of use, the everyday things at hand. Level the less common things up high or down low, so the kitchen moved more efficiently. She found that Cole kept his lantern oil in 3 different places and consolidated it to one. She mended the curtain in Lily's room that had been hanging by a single ring. She oiled the hinges on the back door that had been crying out every time it opened. She did not call attention to any of these things. She simply did them. On the 5th day, she came into the kitchen at first light to find her boots beside the stove. She stood looking at them for a moment before she picked them up. Cole had repaired the left sole which had been pulling away from the upper, and he had done it neatly with proper cobbler's tack and a strip of leather cut to size. The right boot had a small tear in the heel lining that she had not mentioned to anyone, because she had told no one about it. And that boot had been resoled as well. She turned them over in her hands. She set them down. She looked at the floor. She had not cried when Edgar Holst threw her into the snow. She had not cried in the cold, in the dark, in the long 2 hours of walking to nowhere. She did not cry now, but something moved through her chest, a slow, deep shift, like ice giving way in a river, and she had to stand still for a moment and wait for it to pass. She put the boots on and went to work. Cole did not mention them at breakfast. He ate his eggs and drank his coffee and talked to Lily about whether the north fence needed mending before the next storm. And Nora refilled his cup and said nothing. And he said nothing, and it was the most respectful conversation she had ever been part of. By the end of the first week, the question of her staying had ceased to be a question. Cole said one evening without preamble, as if they had already been discussing it, "I will pay you fair wages come spring when the cattle money comes in. Can't do it now, but I aim to." "Room and meals is sufficient," she said. "It ain't," he said. "Room and meals is what you give a relation. You are working. You will be paid." She looked at him. He was looking at his plate. "All right," she said. That was the agreement. No paper, no formal terms, just the plain word of 2 people who were each, in their own way, trying to do the right thing and doing it quietly, without ceremony, because that was the only way either of them knew. Lily recovered her full strength by the end of the 2nd week, and the house changed again with her recovery, filled up with the particular energy of a healthy 8-year-old who has been confined too long and is now making up for lost time. She followed Nora everywhere. She sat on the kitchen counter and asked questions while Nora cooked. She brought in armloads of snow on her boots and dropped them in the front hall and forgot about them. She conducted lengthy debates with herself about the moral standing of various animals, which ones were deserving of names, and which were merely livestock. "Biscuit has a name," she announced one morning, "because Biscuit is a friend. The chickens do not have names because they are not friends, they are workers." "That seems a reasonable distinction," Nora said. "Papa says I should not name the pigs." "Your papa is probably right." Lily thought about this. "I named them anyway," she said, "but only in my head, so it does not count officially." Nora pressed her lips together very firmly. Cole came in at noon that day and found both of them shaking with suppressed laughter over something Lily had said, and he stood in the door with snow on his hat and looked at the sight of his daughter, laughing in someone's kitchen, and the expression on his face was so complicated and so unguarded that Nora looked away immediately, the way you look away from something too private to witness. He was a quiet man, not in the way of a man who has nothing to say, but in the way of a man who has learned through some particular grief that words cost more than he can always afford. She pieced his history together slowly, not through questions, but through the texture of small things. The photograph on the shelf above the fireplace, a woman with light hair and Lily's eyes, looking at the camera with a directness that was striking, and a little sad. The way Cole slept, she could tell by the dark circles, and the way he moved in the early morning, like a man who has not gone far enough under to rest. The way he watched Lily, sometimes not with the normal parental vigilance, but with something closer to vigilance of a different kind. The watchfulness of a man who knows what it is to have something taken and cannot stop calculating the odds of it happening again. His wife had been dead 4 years. Lily had been 4 when it happened. Cole had been running this ranch, raising this child, and carrying whatever it was he carried alone for 4 years. Nora knew something about carrying things alone. She did not offer to help him with his. She simply worked beside him in the ordinary way of two people who share a house, and she tried to be the kind of presence that does not add to a person's load. He noticed, she thought, he was not a man who missed things. One evening in the 3rd week, a cold, clear Tuesday, with stars so thick and low, they seemed almost domestic. Nora was sitting by the fire after Lily had gone to bed, working on a shirt of Cole's that had frayed at both cuffs. The fire was burning well, and the house was quiet, except for the pop and shift of the wood and the faint wind at the windows. She had been sewing for perhaps 20 minutes when she became aware that Cole had come in from checking the livestock and had stopped somewhere in the room. She did not look up. She kept her eyes on the needle and the worn linen cuff and the careful small stitches. He crossed to his chair by the fire. He sat down. He picked up the almanac he had been reading and then set it down again without opening it. He looked at the fire. "You are good with her," he said. Nora kept sewing. "She is easy to be good with." She wasn't for a while. He said it simply without self-pity. After her mama passed, she stopped talking for near about 3 months. Just stopped. He paused. Doctor said it was grief. Said she would come back to herself. She did. But those 3 months. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Children carry things deeply, Nora said. They do not always have the words for it. No. He turned the almanac over in his hands. She talks about her mama now, more than she used to. I reckon that is on account of you. Nora looked up at that. I think, she said carefully, that she feels safe enough now to talk about her. That is not on account of me. That is on account of you. You made this house safe. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that she could not name, a flicker too fast and too complex to catch. He looked back at the fire. I ain't always sure about that, he said. She did not answer. She went back to her sewing. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in a long, slow sound like breathing, and the fire shifted, and the room held them both in its warmth, and nothing more was said. And it was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of quiet that people who live alone almost never find. The quiet of not being alone. She finished the cuffs, and folded the shirt, and set it on the arm of his chair, and said good night, and went upstairs, and she lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and thinking about nothing in particular, and refusing firmly and deliberately to think about the expression on his face when she had said, "You made this house safe." She had been wrong about kindness before. She intended to be careful, but the days kept coming, and they kept being what they were. Cole added shelves to the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon, not asking whether she wanted them, just appearing with lumber and tools and the focused quiet of a man who has decided to do a thing and is doing it. Lily stood on a chair and handed him nails one at a time and offered structural opinions that Cole accepted with perfect seriousness. Nora stood at the stove and watched from the corner of her eye, and felt something happening to her defenses, not a collapse, nothing so dramatic as that, just a slow and inexorable softening like bread dough that has been left to work and is beginning to yield. The shelves were exactly the right height. She had not said anything about the height of the existing shelves, the fact that she had to reach up on her toes for the everyday items, which was a small but constant inconvenience. Cole had simply watched her work and calculated it himself. She arranged her pots on the new shelves and stood back and looked at them. "Fits better," Cole said. From behind her, neither a question nor a boast, just an observation. "It does," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and gathered his tools and went to put them away, and Lily said, "Now your kitchen is right, Miss Nora." And Nora said, "It was always right, Lily." But she was looking at the shelves when she said it, and she was not entirely sure that was the truth. She dreamed that night of her mother's kitchen. In the dream, the stove was lit, and the room smelled of cinnamon, and the window showed nothing but white sky, and her mother was standing at the counter with her back turned, and Nora stood in the doorway, wanting to go in and not moving, not moving, not moving. And then she woke. The room was dark. The ranch was quiet. She lay there and listened to the silence and thought, "I am trying not to want this." The thought sat in her chest all the way to morning. The trouble with ordinary happiness, she had learned, was that it arrived without announcement, disguised as just another day. So you did not know to be afraid of it until it was already too late to protect yourself. It came on a Wednesday, 4 weeks in. She had been making bread, the serious weekly baking that she had fallen into without discussion. 4 loaves of white, 2 of the denser brown, and Lily had been sitting on the counter, eating dried apple rings from the jar, and explaining to Nora in great detail the political situation among the chickens, which apparently involved a power struggle of some complexity. And Cole had come in from outside and stomped the snow off his boots in the doorway and said without looking up from his own boots, "Smells good in here." It was 4 words. It was less than nothing. Men said that kind of thing without thinking about it. But Lily said, "Doesn't it always?" And Cole finally looked up, not at the bread, at Nora, and there was a moment, very brief, no longer than a breath, where neither of them said anything, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread was rising, and the child was swinging her legs against the counter, and the smell of yeast and wood smoke was in the air. And something happened to Nora's chest that she did not have a name for and did not want to examine closely. "It does," Cole said quietly, and went to wash his hands. Nora pressed her palms flat on the bread dough and pushed hard and focused on the texture of it, the live elastic resistance, and told herself very firmly that she was a practical woman who had learned better than to build any weight on a moment's worth of warmth. She did not quite believe herself, but she tried. That was the thing about Cole Merritt. He did not make it easy to be sensible. He was not a charming man, not in the practiced way of men who know they are being charming. He was something harder to account for a man who simply did what he said he would do, who treated every living thing on his property, the horses, the child, the hired woman in his kitchen, with the same steady and undemonstrative consideration. He did not flatter. He did not explain himself. He handed her the last biscuit at supper, because her plate was empty, without asking whether she wanted it. He saddled her a horse on the clear mornings, without being asked when he thought she might want to go out, and he never said a word about it, just had the horse ready at the post. That was the most dangerous kind of man. Nora knew it. She knew it, and she watched herself carefully, and she kept her distances, and she was almost certain she was managing. Almost. Lily fell asleep one evening with her head in Nora's lap. It happened without drama. They had been sitting by the fire, Nora reading aloud from the small collection of books on the shelf. An old copy of something with illustrations of birds, and Lily had been listening with the drowsy attention of a child who is fighting sleep and losing, and at some point, between the woodpecker and the red-tailed hawk, she had tipped sideways, and her head had found Nora's leg, and she was simply completely and deeply asleep. Nora sat very still. She looked down at the child's face, smooth and unguarded in sleep, the dark lashes against the pale cheek. She rested one hand very lightly on Lily's hair. She heard Cole come in from the barn. She heard him stop. She did not look up. She could feel him standing in the doorway, in the way you feel a fire from across a room, a warmth with a direction to it. He came forward after a moment and crouched down beside the chair, bringing himself level with his daughter's sleeping face, and he looked at her the way fathers look at their children, when the children cannot see them, looking with a love so large and so unarmored, it was almost painful to be near. Then he looked at Nora. She did not look away this time. The fire crackled. Outside the wind was up again, the long Montana dark, pressing against the windows. Cole's face was close enough that she could see the weather in it, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the particular set of his mouth that she had learned to read as the expression he wore when something had gotten past his defenses. He opened his mouth, he closed it. "I will carry her up," he said finally. "All right," Nora said. He lifted Lily easily, the practiced lift of a man who has been carrying this child since she was small, and Lily turned her face into his shoulder without waking, and made a sound like a small, satisfied animal, and Cole carried her toward the stairs. He stopped at the bottom step. He said without turning, "Nora." "Yes." A long pause. "The fire, the wind. I am glad you found the barn." "Mitt," he said. He went upstairs. Nora sat in the chair by the fire for a long time. Her hands were in her lap, and the book was closed beside her, and the house was quiet around her, and she sat there and breathed and let herself just for a moment feel the full weight of where she was. A warm house, a child who reached for her, a man who in the plain and unhurried manner of a man who means what he says, had just told her something he would never have said in fancier words. She was glad of the barn, too. She was deeply, terrifyingly glad. And that she understood was the precise thing that had been trying to happen to her for 4 weeks, and had now quietly and without permission succeeded. The fire burned low. She did not move to stoke it. She sat in the fading warmth and looked at the room around her, the boots by the door, the coat on the peg, the shelves she had organized, the curtains she had mended, the bowl of dried apples on the table, that Lily reached into every morning like it was treasure. She looked at all of it. Then she looked at the stairs. She thought, "I do not know how to want this safely." And somewhere in the walls of the old house the woods settled and shifted with a sound like a quiet answer, and the last of the fire glowed red and orange in the dark, and the night went on around her patient, as Montana itself, waiting to see what she would do next. The shelves held her pots. The boots fit. The bread rose every Wednesday without fail. March came in cold and stayed that way, but inside the Merritt house something had shifted in the quality of the warmth. It was not a dramatic shift. It was the kind of change you notice only in retrospect, the way you notice a season has turned not on any single day, but in the accumulation of small evidences. The angle of the light through the kitchen window. The way Lily had stopped asking when Nora was leaving. The way Cole had stopped pretending he was not watching the door when supper was close to ready. Nora noticed all of it. She filed it away, in the careful ledger she kept of things she was not yet ready to believe. She went on working. It was what she knew how to do. The morning she dropped the plate, she had been awake since 4. It had not been a nightmare exactly. It had been a memory which was worse because memories had the weight of actual things. Thomas, in one of his darker moods, moving through the kitchen behind her while she cooked, his voice low and deliberate, cataloging her failures with the thoroughness of a man who had made a study of them. She had learned in those years to make herself very small in a room, to occupy as little space as possible, to keep her hands moving and her eyes down, and to agree with things she did not believe, because disagreement cost more than she could afford. She had woken at 4 with the sound of his voice still in her, and had lain in the dark until she could no longer stand the ceiling, and had come downstairs to work. She was reaching for the large serving plate on the high shelf, the good china one that had been there when she arrived, handed down from someone she did not know who, when her hand caught the edge of it wrong and it came off the shelf, and she grabbed for it and missed. And it hit the floor in 2 clean pieces. She stood looking at the pieces. Her whole body went still in the old way, the way she had learned in the years with Thomas, the held-breath stillness of a woman waiting to find out how bad it was going to be. Her shoulders came up, her chin went down. She was braced in the way of a person who has been hit before, and whose body has not forgotten it even when her mind tries to. She heard Cole's boots on the stairs. He came into the kitchen and took in the plate on the floor and looked at her. She did not look at him. She was looking at the pieces, and her face was doing something she could not control, that terrible preparatory tightening. He crossed the kitchen. She made herself not step back. He crouched down beside the broken plate and picked up both pieces and turned them over in his hands, with the attention of a man assessing damage, the way he might look at a cracked fence post, or a split board, practical and unhurried. Then he set both pieces on the counter and straightened up and looked at her hands. "You cut yourself," he said. She looked at her hands. "No." "Good." He looked at the plate. That was Margaret's grandmother's. It had a crack in it already from before. He paused. "I should have put it somewhere it wasn't gonna get reached for." Nora stared at him. "It was my fault," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "It was a plate on a high shelf with a crack in it," he said. "Ain't anybody's fault." He turned and put the pieces in the crate near the door, carefully, not throwing them. "I'll see if Hannigan's store carries something similar." He went to get his coat off the peg. Nora stood in the kitchen and felt something moving through her that she did not know the name, for something large and slow, like a current under ice. She had been braced for a blow that did not come. Her body did not know what to do with that. It stood in the middle of the kitchen, being braced for nothing, and gradually, the way a fist unclenches it, let go. She put the kettle on. Her hands were not quite steady. She did not cry. She had learned not to cry in kitchens years ago because it accomplished nothing and made the onions harder to see. But she stood at the stove for a moment with her hand on the kettle handle, and she breathed in and out, slow and even, and she let herself feel the full strangeness of what had just happened. She had made a mistake. The world had not ended. Nobody had made her pay for it. She had always known in theory that this was how it was supposed to work. She had not until this moment felt it in her body. When Cole came back in for breakfast 40 minutes later, the kitchen smelled of coffee and salt pork and fresh biscuits and Nora was standing at the stove in her usual place, and she looked up when he came in, and she said, "Sit down. It is ready." And he sat down and he ate, and he said the biscuits were the best he had had in some while, and she said she had used a little more lard than usual, and he said he reckoned that was the secret. And Lily came down in her nightgown and ate 4 biscuits, without comment, which was the highest compliment available from that quarter. It was an ordinary breakfast. Nora held it in both hands all day like something breakable, aware that she had been given something, not knowing yet what to do with it. Lily began to call her Mama Nora in the 3rd week of March. It started without ceremony in the middle of a conversation about whether crows were more intelligent than horses, a debate that Lily conducted with great seriousness, and that Nora engaged with as seriously as she could manage. They had been out in the yard, Lily crouching to examine something in the snow, and she had looked up and said, "Mama Nora, do you think Biscuit knows her own name?" Nora had gone very still. Lily had not noticed. She was already back to examining whatever was in the snow. Nora looked out at the fence line, at the long white field beyond it, at the sky that was beginning just barely to consider spring. She breathed in through her nose. The air was cold and clean, and smelled of pine and distance. "I think Biscuit knows a great many things," she said, when she could trust her voice. She did not ask Lily not to call her that. She could not find any part of herself that wanted to. She did not tell Cole. He heard it himself 2 days later in passing, and she was watching him when it happened, the brief arrest of his motion, his hand stopping on the door handle for just a moment. He did not look at her. He went on outside. When he came back in for supper, he was quieter than usual, and after Lily had gone to bed, he sat by the fire for a long time, without the almanac, without anything, just sitting and looking at the flames with the expression he wore when he was working something out. Nora sewed and did not speak and waited. He said finally, "She called you that?" "Yes." "Does it bother you?" She set her sewing down. She looked at him directly. "No," she said. "It does not bother me." He looked at the fire. The muscle in his jaw moved. "She loved her mama," he said. "She does not forget her." "I know." Nora held his gaze when he finally turned to look at her. "I would not want her to. It dem psyche." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, measuring eyes, and she let him look, because she had nothing to hide in what she had said. It was the plain truth, and she was not in the habit of being ashamed of plain truth. "All right," he said at last. It was not a small thing the way he said it. It was the way a man says a thing when he has decided it. When he has turned it all the way over and looked at the underside and decided, it stands. He picked up the almanac. Nora picked up her sewing. The fire burned steadily between them, and neither of them said anything more, and it was in its quiet way one of the most significant conversations she had ever had. The last week of March brought 3 clear days in a row, the kind of days that are not yet warm but carry in them the argument for warmth, bright and thin-aired, and smelling of mud under the snow. Cole let Lily out into the yard on the second clear day, and Nora watched from the window as the child ran in wide, expanding circles, simply for the pleasure of having room her arms out. Her head tipped back her boots, throwing up small sprays of snow. Cole was mending fence at the near edge of the property. He stopped and watched Lily run. Nora watched him watch her. She was standing at the kitchen window with a dish towel in her hands, having forgotten entirely what she had meant to do with it, and she was watching Cole Merritt watch his daughter run in circles in the last snow of winter. And his face and profile was open in a way she had not seen it, the careful guardedness gone, replaced by something simpler and more undefended. He was not thinking about his dead wife in that moment. Nora could see it clearly from where she stood. He was just watching his daughter be happy, and he was beneath the weathered and careful exterior, a man capable of being made happy by that simple fact. She had not known when she crawled into his barn, half frozen and ready to accept whatever the night brought, that she was going to find this. She had not been looking for it. She had stopped believing it existed. She turned away from the window before he could look up and find her watching. She dried the dish that was already dry. She stood at the counter and looked at the kitchen, her pots on the right height shelves, the dried herbs she had hung in the window, the braided rug she had found rolled up in the back room and beaten clean and put down in front of the stove. She had made this space her own without meaning to, and now it was in ways she could not fully account for hers, not by ownership, by the more durable claim of care. She wondered what that meant. She was still wondering when the door opened and Lily came in, trailing cold air and breathless with report. "I found a feather," Lily announced, holding it up. It was a crow feather, blue-black and perfect. "It is from the smart crow, the one that watches the barn." "How do you know it is the same crow?" "Okay. Because it is the watching kind of feather," Lily said with the serene logic of 8 years, and put it in the cup on the windowsill where she kept her finds, a collection that now included 2 smooth stones, a piece of quartz, a button of uncertain origin, and a small dried sprig of something Nora thought might have been lavender. Cole came in behind her, stomping his boots. He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter and looked at the feather in the cup. "Lily," he said, "that crow is going to come in here after that feather." "He is welcome," Lily said grandly, and went upstairs for her coat. Cole looked at Nora. Nora looked at Cole. A shared look, brief and warm and edged with the particular amusement of 2 adults who have found themselves improbably raising this child together. She looked away first. She went back to the stove, but the look stayed with her. It sat in her chest like a coal, small and hot and steady, and she could not decide whether she wanted to be rid of it or not. She kept it. She could not help it. She kept it the way you keep a thing you know you should not become too fond of, carefully in a protected place, aware of its fragility. That was the last week of March. The first week of April brought mud season and longer evenings and the sound of runoff in the creek. And it also brought a Sunday that Nora would later mark. As the day, the careful distance between herself and Cole Merritt finally gave way entirely, not with any dramatic event, but with something much smaller and therefore much harder to defend against. She had been making applesauce from the last of the stored apples, slightly soft now and needing to be used, and Cole had come in from the barn and washed his hands, and without asking, had taken the paring knife from the second drawer, exactly where she kept it, and sat down at the table and begun to peel the apples she had set in the bowl. She stood and watched him peel an apple with the focused efficiency of a man who has peeled apples his entire life and sees nothing remarkable in it. "You don't have to," she said. "I reckon I know that," he said, and kept peeling. She sat down across from him and took up the other knife and began to core the peeled ones, and they worked in silence for a while, the sound of the knives against the cutting boards, the smell of the apples, the thin April light coming through the windows. "My mother used to make applesauce," he said. "So did mine. She put cinnamon in. So do I." He looked at the apple in his hand. "Lily's going to eat the whole batch before it cools." "I am counting on it," Nora said. "I made twice what we need." He looked up at that. Something in his expression softened. "You think of things," he said, "before they are needed." It was not a grand thing to say. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without decoration. But she felt it differently than she would have felt it a month ago, felt it land somewhere below the practical level, somewhere she had been trying to keep clear. "Someone has to," she said. and meant it to sound light, but it did not quite. He set the apple down. He looked at her across the table with the directness he brought to everything, that quality of attention that gave you nowhere comfortable to hide. "Nora," he said. She kept her eyes on the apple she was coring. "Yes. I want to say something, and I'm not sure I have the words for it right." She set her knife down. She made herself look at him. His face was doing the thing it sometimes did when he was working something difficult. That interior effort, visible in the set of his jaw, the slight line between his brows. "You came here half frozen and with nothing," he said, "and in less than 3 months you have made this house into something I had forgotten a house could be." He paused. He looked at the bowl of apples. He looked back at her. "Lily is happy. I have not seen her this way in 4 years." Another pause. "I am saying I am grateful, and I am saying it does not begin to cover what I mean." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the creek was running over its stones. "Cole," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, "I am the one who should be grateful. You opened your door to a woman you found in your barn. You treated her with more decency than she had seen in a long while." "That is just common decency," he said. "What you have done is something else." She looked at him. He looked at her. Between them on the table, the bowl of apples sat in the April light, and the whole moment had the quality of something about to tip. Something balanced at the edge of a change neither of them had words for yet. She was not ready. She could feel herself not ready, could feel the old defenses coming up. The practiced withdrawal of a woman who has been wrong before about what warmth meant and what it cost her. "We should finish the apples," she said softly. He held her gaze for one more moment. "Yes," he said, "we should." He picked up his knife. She picked up hers. They went on working, and the applesauce came out well, and Lily did indeed eat a considerable portion of it before supper. And Cole said nothing except that he had predicted this, and Lily said she could not be held responsible for the excellence of the applesauce. And the evening passed in the ordinary way of evenings in that house. But something had been said. Not all of it. Not yet. Not yet, but enough. Enough to know that the thing she had been careful not to want had been wanting her back quietly, and without announcement for longer than she had allowed herself to see. It had been there in the boots, by the stove, and the shelves at the right height, and the steady, undemonstrative way he moved through the world around her, making room for her in it. She lay awake that night and looked at the ceiling, and let herself for the first time think about it without flinching. She was afraid. She was afraid the way you are afraid of high places, not because you think you will fall, but because some part of you understands that the fall is possible, and that, from this particular height, it would matter. But she was also underneath the fear, something else, something she had not been in a long time. The word for it was simple. She did not let herself say it yet. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that has been out in the cold and is only just beginning to come back to its right temperature, carefully with both hands, giving it time. Down the hall, Lily slept and breathed and was safe. Downstairs, the fire burned down to embers. The house held them all in its walls, and the night went on around it, and the creek ran over its stones in the dark. Moving forward the way things do when the ice has finally let them go. The mud dried. The creek settled. April moved into May with the slow authority of a season that knows it has won. The ranch came alive in ways that Nora had not seen in winter. The fields greening up along the creek banks, the horses restless and bright-eyed in the longer light, the mornings arriving earlier each day like a neighbor who has learned they are welcome and no longer waits to be invited. Cole was out from first light to last the spring work, coming at a man all at once the way it always did, fencing and planting, and the long days of driving cattle to higher ground. He came in at supper, with the smell of the land on him grass, and turned earth and the particular damp warmth of horses worked hard, and he ate with the appetite of a man who has spent himself completely and was satisfied by it. Nora watched the season change and felt it changing inside her as well. She had stopped arguing with herself. It was an exhausting argument, and she had been losing it for weeks, and somewhere in the first warm days of May, she had simply set it down the way you set down. A heavy thing you have been carrying too long. She did not announce this to anyone. She did not have to. It was an interior rearrangement, quiet and complete. And she suspected Cole had noticed it, the way he noticed most things, without comment through the accumulation of small observations. He stood a little closer than he had in February. Not close enough to speak of, not close enough to name. Just closer. Passing her in the kitchen, his hand would brush her shoulder, and he would not step away. She would hand him his coffee mug, and their fingers would meet on the handle, and neither of them would remark on it, but neither would they hurry to separate. Lily noticed too. Lily noticed everything, and had the discretion of a child who understands on some animal level that there are things happening in the grown-up world that are good things, and that the right response is to be very busy in another direction. She was very busy in another direction a great deal in May. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of warm, bright Tuesday that feels like a gift after a long winter, when Nora heard the horse. She was in the kitchen garden. Cole had broken for her at the side of the house, working the soil up around the seedlings she had started inside, when she heard it, the sound of a horse, coming up the main track at a deliberate pace. Not the loose, easy trot of a neighbor, paying a call, controlled, purposeful. She straightened up and turned. Edgar Holst rode a gray gelding, the way he did everything, with the assumption that the road belonged to him and everything on either side of it was simply scenery. He was a broad man running to weight in his middle years, with a face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder and more satisfied with itself. He wore a good coat. He always wore a good coat. In Nora's experience, men like Edgar Holst spent considerably on the impression of prosperity because it was part of how they operated, how they convinced people that the papers they held had weight, that the numbers they cited were real and binding and unassailable. He saw her in the garden. He smiled. It was the smile she remembered. Patient, certain. The smile of a man who has done his accounting and found the figures work in his favor. Cole had ridden out at first light to check the north pasture. Lily was inside. The ranch hand, a taciturn young man named Garrett, who came 3 days a week, had not come today. Nora was alone. She set down her trowel and walked to the edge of the garden and waited. Running would have been worse. Holst liked running. It confirmed something for him. He pulled up his horse at the gate and looked down at her with the leisurely attention of a man who has all the time he needs. "Mrs. Ashby," he said, "you are looking considerably better than the last time I saw you." "Mr. Holst," she said. He dismounted and tied the horse at the post and came through the gate without being invited, which was also something she remembered about him. Edgar Holst did not wait for invitations. He looked around the property with the appraising squint of a man calculating worth. "Fine spread," he said. "Merritt does well for himself." He looked back at her. "Found yourself a comfortable arrangement." "I work here," she said. "So you do." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document and held it out. She did not take it. He smiled again and set it on the fence rail. "Thomas's notes, Mrs. Ashby, properly assigned to me 18 months before his death. I don't reckon you dispute the signatures." She looked at the paper. She did not pick it up. "I have no money," she said. No, he agreed pleasantly. You don't, which is why I am here to discuss alternate arrangements. He leaned his forearms on the fence rail and looked at her with the relaxed confidence of a man who has had this conversation before and knows how it ends. There is a logging operation up in the Flathead Valley, owned by a man named Curran. He takes on contracted workers, winter and summer both. It is not pleasant work, but it is honest, and the debt would be discharged in 3 years. 3 years in a logging camp in the Flathead Valley was not 3 years of honest work. They both knew what it was, a logging camp at the edge of nowhere, for a woman alone in the contracted service of a man who owned the camp and the store and the doctor and the scales was something a person did not come back from, in the same condition they went in, if they came back at all. You have 24 hours to settle your affairs, Holst said. I will return tomorrow morning. He picked up the document and tapped it once against the rail. Do not think about running. I know where you are now, and I have the law on my side. He looked at the house, and I would hate for your comfortable arrangement here to suffer any difficulties on account of your situation. He was threatening Cole. That was what he was doing. The easy implication that he could make trouble for a man who was harboring an indebted woman, that he had connections in town at the bank, at the land office, and that those connections could be applied like pressure to a soft place. She had known men like Edgar Holst her entire life. They were a type. They found the thing you cared about, and they stood near it. He tipped his hat and walked back to his horse and rode out at the same deliberate pace, certain that the matter was settled. Nora stood at the fence until he was out of sight. Then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. She thought with great clarity and precision, the way she always thought when the situation was bad enough to burn away everything except what mattered. She thought Cole must not be involved in this. She thought I brought this with me. She thought Lily is happy and safe, and this house has its peace, and I will not be the reason it loses either. She had been here before, not in these exact circumstances, but in the essential shape of them, the moment where you understand that the kindest thing you can do for the people you have come to love is to remove yourself from the equation before you become a problem they have to carry. She had thought she was done with that kind of thinking. She had been wrong. She went upstairs, and she took the canvas bag from under the bed, and she began with the methodical care of a woman who is holding herself together through the performance of simple tasks to pack what was hers. The change of dress, her mother's Bible, the photograph. She moved quietly, not thinking past the next thing, the way you move through a dark room by touch. She took out the photograph and looked at it for a moment. Thomas. His face young and uncertain and not unkind. She thought of his weakness without bitterness, now just the clear-eyed assessment she had finally arrived at, after years of trying to find someone to blame. He had been what he was. She had loved him the way you love something that needs more than it can give back, until the account ran empty. She put the photograph in the bag. She went along the hall to Lily's room. She stood in the doorway. The room smelled of the child of the lavender she had hung in the window and the wool of the blankets, and the faint sweetness of the dried apples Lily kept in a twist of paper on the nightstand. The crow feather was still in the cup on the dresser. Nora stood in the doorway for a long time. She went back downstairs. She left her bag by the door and went to the stove, and she made supper because supper needed to be made, and because she did not know how to be in a kitchen without cooking, and because some part of her needed the comfort of the familiar motions, the knife and the board and the heat, and the smell of things coming together into something good. She was at the stove when Cole came in. He stopped inside the door. He looked at the bag. He looked at her back. She kept her face toward the stove. Holst was here, she said. She heard him come further into the room. She heard him stop. Tell me, he said. She told him. All of it flat and factual, the document, the logging camp, the 24 hours, the implication about the ranch. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands moving on the pot because she needed them to move. When she was done, the kitchen was very quiet. I am going to go with him, she said. In the morning. It is the right thing to do. He has a legal claim, and I will not let him use it against you. She heard Cole move. She thought he was going to the table. She thought he was going to sit down and consider it the way he considered things, turning it over, finding the practical angle. Instead, he was behind her. She turned. He was close, closer than he had ever stood. She could see the day's work on him, the dust on his coat, the tight set of his jaw, that meant the careful man was somewhere just underneath the surface of a man who was not feeling careful at all. He reached out and he took the bag from her hands. She had not realized she was holding it. She had carried it from the door without noticing. He set it on the floor. He kept his hand around her wrist. For a moment, not gripping, just present the warmth of his hand against her pulse. No, he said. Cole. No. His voice was low and absolute. You are not walking out of here in the dark to go to a logging camp in the Flathead, because Edgar Holst has a piece of paper. He released her wrist. He stepped back, giving her room. But he did not step far. You are not leaving Lily. She felt the words go through her like a current. You are not leaving. He said again, quieter, and this time he did not add anything to it, and the thing he did not add was present in the space between them as clearly as if he had spoken it. She looked at him. Her eyes were burning. She would not cry. She had made herself a promise years ago about not crying in kitchens, and she was going to keep it even now, even with Cole Merritt standing in front of her, looking at her the way he was looking at her, with that open and undefended expression that she had only glimpsed in pieces before, and that was now entirely visible. I don't have any money to pay the debt, she said. He has the law. He has a law, Cole said. There are others. He looked at her steadily. I need you to trust me until morning. Can you do that? She looked at him for a long moment. She said, What are you going to do? He said, The right thing, if you will let me. She did not ask what that meant. She found standing there in the kitchen with the supper cooling on the stove and the bag on the floor, and Cole Merritt looking at her as if her answer was the most important piece of information he had received in years, that she did not need to ask. She found that she trusted him in the uncomplicated and unearned way that is not really unearned at all. That is the product of 100 small evidences accumulated over months, the boots and the shelves and the apple peeling, and the way he had crouched down to look at his daughter's sleeping face, the way he had never once, not once in all these months, given her reason to brace herself. Yes, she said, I can do that. He breathed out. Something in his shoulders released. Go sit with Lily, he said. I'll be back by midnight. Where are you going? Town. He was already reaching for his coat. He stopped with it half on and looked at her over his shoulder. Nora, don't pack that bag again. She looked at the bag on the floor. All right, she said. He went out. She heard his horse, and then she did not hear it. She went upstairs to Lily's room, and she sat in the chair by the window, and she watched the child sleep, and she prayed quietly in the plain and private way she had always prayed, not with formal language, but just the direct address of a person speaking to a providence they have learned to trust, even when they cannot see the shape of what is coming. She prayed for Cole to be safe on the road. She prayed for Lily to go on sleeping. She prayed for herself, not for rescue, She had stopped praying for rescue a long time ago, but for the courage to receive what was being offered without sabotaging it out of fear. She sat in the chair, and Lily breathed in the dark, and the hours moved. At some point, without deciding to, she slept. She dreamed again of her mother's kitchen, but in this dream she went through the door. Her mother turned around. The stove was lit. There was room at the table. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats coming up the track. The window showed a black sky and the first thin gray of coming dawn. She was stiff from the chair. She went to the window and looked out and saw Cole's horse coming in at a trot, and Cole on it, and behind him, faintly visible in the gray light, the shape of another rider. She went downstairs. Cole came through the door with snow on his coat, though it had not snowed, which meant he had ridden far and high and through terrain that still held winter in its folds. He was tired. She could see it in the way he moved, the careful deliberateness of a man running on decision rather than energy. He reached inside his coat and produced a document. He set it on the table. She looked at it. She looked at him. "The land office in Millhaven keeps a second registry," he said. "Judge Alderton had night business with them last month that I happened to know about, which gave me some standing to knock on his door at 9 in the evening." He paused. "There is a provision in the territorial statute. An assigned debt cannot be used to compel the labor of a married woman without the consent of her husband. It is old law, almost never invoked." He looked at her, because almost no one knows it is there. Nora stared at the document. "Cole," she said. "I also," he said. And he stopped and he looked at the document, and then he looked at her. And his voice, when he continued, was quieter, stripped of the practical tone. Just the plain thing underneath it. "I also went to Reverend Marsh and woke him up, which I do not reckon he appreciated, and I asked him something that I should have asked him first, before the legal business. But I was in a hurry, and I am not always good at doing things in the right order." She could not speak. "I asked him," Cole said, "whether he would marry us. Tonight, if you were willing." The kitchen held the silence. The gray light was coming through the windows, now the first pale blue of a morning that was going to be clear and cold and sharp as new glass. Nora looked at this man, this careful, quiet, uncharming, irreplaceable man who had ridden through the night to find a law to protect her, and had thought to bring a preacher, and was now standing in his own kitchen at 4 in the morning with snow on his coat, and his heart entirely visible on his face, waiting for her answer. She thought of all the times she had told herself to be careful. She thought of all the ways she had tried to want less, take up less space, need less from the world than the world seemed unwilling to give. She thought of Lily asleep upstairs. She thought of the boots by the stove and the shelves at the right height, and a man who checked whether her hands were bleeding before he thought about the plate. She said, "You did this in the right order, Hide." Something broke open in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the thing that comes before a smile, the release of a held breath, the unclenching of a jaw that has been tight too long. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He took her hand in both of his, the rough, warm clasp of a man who does not let go of things carelessly. And he held it and looked at her, and she looked back at him and did not look away. And outside the window the sky was turning from gray to the first pale gold of a morning that was just beginning. That was only just beginning. That had, against all the careful accounting of fear and loss and learned smallness, arrived. Reverend Marsh was a small man who looked considerably smaller. At 4 in the morning in his nightcap, standing in the front room of Cole Merritt's house, with a Bible under one arm, and the expression of a man who has been asked to do something irregular, and has decided, after brief reflection, that the Lord's business does not keep regular hours. He looked at Nora. He looked at Cole. He looked at their joined hands. "You are certain," he said. It was not quite a question. "Reverend," Cole said. "I rode to Millhaven and back tonight. I am certain." Marsh cleared his throat and opened his Bible, and they stood together in the front room of the ranch house, in the thin gray of early morning, the fire banked low, the house quiet around them, and they were married. It was not a long ceremony. Marsh was tired and cold and not entirely reconciled to the hour, and Cole was a man who had never required ceremony for things he had already decided in his heart, and Nora stood beside him in her work dress, with her hair not properly done, and her eyes very bright, and her hand in his, and she listened to the old words with the full attention she had not given them the first time years ago, when she had stood in a church in her best dress and believed that the form of a thing was the same as the substance of it. She knew better now. The substance was here, in this room at this hour with this man. When Marsh said the words that required Cole's answer, Cole said them without hesitation, in a voice quiet and level and absolutely sure, and when the words came to Nora, she said them back in the same way, not performing certainty, but simply reporting it. And Marsh looked at them both and seemed to arrive at some private conclusion, and he said the last words and closed his Bible. Cole's hand tightened on hers. Marsh accepted the payment. Cole pressed into his hand, shook both their hands with the slightly dazed dignity of a man who has participated in something he does not yet fully understand, and was escorted to his horse and sent back down the track toward town. They stood on the porch and watched him go. The sky to the east was pale gold. Now the stars gone the morning, coming in clean and cold. The ranch spread out before them in the early light, the fields still holding patches of snow in the low places, the barn dark and solid, the creek glinting somewhere beyond the fence line. Cole was standing beside her close enough that his arm was against hers. She said, "Holst comes in the morning." He comes whenever he likes," Cole said. "He is not going to find what he is expecting. She turned and looked at him. He was looking out at the fields, his jaw set in the particular way that meant a decision was made, and nothing further needed to be said about it. "Cole," he looked at her. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away, again back at the fields. But the corner of his mouth had moved in the way it moved when he was containing something. "Get some sleep," he said. "I'll watch for him. You have been up all night." "So have you. I slept in the chair. You call that sleep?" He looked at her again, and there was something in his eyes that was warm and direct and entirely new. Not different in kind from what had always been there, but different in degree, unguarded in a way that the practical necessities of the night had made possible. "Go on," he said. "I'll be here." She went inside. She climbed the stairs past Lily's room. She lay down on top of her covers with her boots still on, and she looked at the ceiling and thought, "I am married." She thought, "I am Nora Merritt." She thought the bag is still on the kitchen floor, and I am not in it. She slept. She woke to voices downstairs, not raised voices. Holst's voice carried a quality of control that was more dangerous than shouting the smooth, unhurried certainty of a man who believes the conversation has already been decided. She heard Cole's voice beneath it, level and flat, the voice he used when he was most serious. She rose and straightened her dress and went downstairs. She came to the bottom step and stopped. Holst was in the doorway. Not inside, she noted. On the porch, the top step, which was as far as a man could get without actually entering a house, and Cole was in the doorway itself, filling it with the solid, unmovable fact of himself, a cup of coffee in one hand, the other hand easy at his side. Two men on horseback sat in the yard behind Holst. Large men. The kind a man hires when he expects his paperwork to need physical reinforcement. Holst had seen her on the stairs. He was already smiling. Cole did not turn around. He seemed to know she was there without turning. Holst said, "Mrs. Ashby, I am glad you are here. I trust you have had time to consider your position." Cole reached into his shirt pocket. He produced the document from Millhaven. He held it out. He did not hand it to Holst. He held it so Holst could see the seal at the bottom, the red wax impression of the territorial court, which was not a thing you could dismiss or argue with or buy your way around on a Tuesday morning in May. "Mrs. Merritt," Cole said, with a particular quiet emphasis on the name, "considered her position last night. So did I." He took a sip of his coffee. He did not take his eyes off Holst. The Territorial Statute Section 41, Paragraph 3, prohibits the compelled labor of a married woman under debt assignment without the written consent of her husband. I reckon you know the law well enough to know I am not inventing that. I shall make it. Holst's smile did not change, but something changed behind it. A recalculation. She had seen it happen before in men like him, that brief interior adjustment, the reassessment of a position they had believed was unassailable. He looked at the document. He looked at Cole. He looked at Nora on the stairs. "Married," he said, "last night." "This morning," Cole said, "about 4 o'clock. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony. He keeps records. The land office at Millhaven has a copy of the filing." He took another sip of coffee. "You are welcome to check." Holst looked at the two men in the yard. They were looking at each other with the expressions of men who had been hired for a simpler job than this had become. Neither of them had any interest in a legal confrontation with a landowner over a properly documented marriage certificate. Holst looked back at Cole. He was still smiling. She had to give him that. He was a man who did not give up his composure easily. "The debt remains," he said. "The debt is between you and Thomas Ashby's estate," Cole said. "Thomas Ashby is deceased. His estate has been settled and dissolved. You know this because you were at the settlement." He looked at Holst with the flat directness of a man who has done his reading and is not bluffing. "Whatever claim you believed you had on Mrs. Ashby's labor was not valid before this morning, and it is considerably less valid now." A long silence. The horses in the yard moved. One of the hired men coughed. The morning was very bright and very still, the kind of May morning that seems indifferent to the small, difficult dramas of human beings, interested only in its own warmth and light. Holst looked at the document one more time. He looked at Nora. She held his gaze. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs in her work dress, with her hair coming loose and her boots unpolished. And she had never in her life looked less like a woman who was afraid. And she felt it in the straightness of her back and the steadiness of her eyes, felt it as a new and permanent thing, not the performance of courage, but the actual substance of it. Holst turned and went down the steps. He mounted his horse. He said something to the hired men that she could not hear. He did not look back. He rode out of the gate and down the track and around the bend in the road, and he did not come back. The hired men followed. Cole stood in the doorway and watched until they were out of sight. He stood there for a moment, after still and quiet. Then he drank the last of his coffee. He turned around. She was still at the bottom of the stairs. She was aware that her legs were not entirely steady, the delayed response of a body that had been holding itself taut for 24 hours and was only now being given permission to release. Cole looked at her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady. "Yes, I am all right." He set the empty mug on the side table. He came to the bottom of the stairs, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her with the full weight of his attention, that quality of seeing she had never been able to hide from and had finally stopped wanting to. He lifted one hand and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so simple and so careful that she felt it down to the floor. "Good," he said. From upstairs they heard a door open. Lily's voice, drowsy and certain, called down, "Is it breakfast?" Cole's mouth finally did the thing it had been close to doing all morning. He smiled. It transformed his face entirely. She had not seen it fully before, not like this, open and unguarded, and entirely without the careful management he applied to most of his expressions. It was the face of the man underneath the weathered exterior, younger than he looked and more undefended. And it was directed at her, and it was one of the finest things she had ever seen. "It is whatever you want it to be," he called back up the stairs. "Come on down." Lily came down in her nightgown, her dark hair in a tangle, her eyes still soft from sleep. She stopped on the third step and looked at them both, standing close at the bottom of the stairs. Cole's hand still near Nora's face. 8 years old was young. It was not innocent of perception. Lily had her father's eyes, and she used them. "Something happened," she said. It was not a question. Cole looked at Nora. Nora looked at Cole. A look passed between them, brief and complete. The kind of look that belongs to people who have arrived without quite knowing when, at the condition of understanding each other. Cole said, "Reckon we have something to tell you, Lilybird." Lily sat down on the step and folded her hands in her lap, with the composure of a person prepared to hear important news. Cole told her, simply in the plain language he used for everything. He said that he and Nora had been married that morning. He said that nothing had to change if Lily did not want it to. He said that Nora was not going anywhere. Lily listened. Her face moved through several expressions, too quick to follow. Then she looked at Nora. "Are you going to stay?" she said. "Yes," Nora said. "If you will have me." Lily was off the step and across the floor, and her arms were around Nora's waist. Before the sentence was entirely finished, her face pressed into Nora's middle, her grip the fierce and total grip of a child who has learned something about loss and does not intend to be careless with what she loves. Nora put both arms around her. She pressed her face into the child's dark hair, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed. Cole's hand found her shoulder. Not a grip, not a pressure, just present, just there. She opened her eyes. He was looking at her, and there was nothing in his face that he was managing or measuring or holding back. There was only the plain truth of a man who is found in the most unlikely of circumstances in the half-frozen woman he discovered in his barn in the worst storm of the year. The thing he had stopped believing was still available to him. She thought this is what the word home means, not the walls, not the kitchen or the shelves or the well-fitted boots, the people, the specific and irreplaceable people standing in the morning light, their arms full of each other. The winter that followed was the coldest in 6 years. It came down out of Canada in November with the seriousness of a thing that has made up its mind, and it settled over the Merritt Ranch and over the whole of the valley, with the heavy permanence of deep cold that does not apologize for itself. The creek froze solid. The drifts came up past the lower fence posts. The sky stayed white for 3 weeks running, inside the house. None of this mattered very much. Nora had spent October putting up provisions with a thoroughness that Cole called impressive and Lily called excessive, and that turned out by January to have been precisely calibrated. The pantry was full. The wood was stacked high on 3 walls of the covered porch. The root cellar held more than enough to carry them through to March. She had also, on an afternoon in late October, begun teaching Lily to make pie crust. It was a serious undertaking. Pie crust required cold hands and a light touch, and the willingness to stop working the dough before you thought it was ready. And Lily had warm hands and considerable enthusiasm and a strong personal opinion about when things were ready, which meant that the first 3 attempts produced crust that was more admirable in intention than execution. The 4th attempt was nearly right. The secret, Nora told her, standing beside her at the counter with their hands in the flour, is to trust the dough. It tells you when it is done. You have to listen. Lily worked the dough with the focused concentration she brought to everything she cared about. How does it tell you? It changes under your hands. It stops fighting you. Lily considered this with great seriousness. Like biscuit, she said, when you have been patient long enough. Nora looked at her. Exactly like that. Lily beamed. Cole came in from the barn that evening to the smell of apple pie baking, which was a smell that had existed in his memory for 4 years, as something irrecoverable belonging to a time before. He stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and something moved through his face that Nora caught from across the kitchen. She went to him. She took the cold off his coat with both hands, the practical pressing motion of straightening a man's lapels, and looked up at him. Lily made it, she said. Mostly. He looked past her to where Lily was setting the table with the focused ceremony she brought to table, setting each fork placed with the deliberateness of a person who takes the task seriously. He looked back at Nora. He said, "I reckon I am the luckiest man in the valley." She said, "That is a very low bar." "It is a cold valley." He laughed. It was a low sound not practiced, a little rusty from disuse, but entirely real, and she felt it, the way she felt the warmth of the stove, as a fundamental physical fact. He put his hands on either side of her face, and he looked at her for a moment, just looked. The way he had looked at her in the kitchen in March, when she had said, "You made this house safe." Except that everything was different now. There was no distance left between them, no careful management of what was allowed. He pressed his forehead to hers. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. "Supper is ready," Lily announced from the table with the authority of a person who has set the forks correctly and considers this to have established the agenda. Cole released her. He went to wash his hands. Nora carried the pot to the table, and they sat down, the 3 of them, in the warm and well-lit room, with the storm doing what it liked outside, and the pie cooling on the counter, and the fire burning steadily in the grate. They said grace. Cole said it, as he always did, brief and direct, the plain address of a man who does not dress up his gratitude in language it does not need. Nora held Lily's hand on one side, and Cole's on the other, and she listened to the words and let them be true. Christmas Eve came on a Tuesday. Nora had been awake since 5, not from anxiety, but from the simple eagerness of a woman who had planned this day for 2 months and wanted to do it properly. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and apple and the particular deep warmth of a house that has been baking since before light. She had made the sugar cookies Lily had asked for. Pressed into shapes with the cutters she had found in the back of the pantry, shapes that were probably meant to be stars and trees, but had, under Lily's enthusiastic decoration, become something more abstract and considerably more colorful. Lily had been up since 6, which was later than Nora had expected, and spoke well of her self-control. She came downstairs in her good dress, the red wool one that Nora had let out at the seams, and retrimmed with new ribbon, and she stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed in deeply, and then she crossed the kitchen and wrapped her arms around Nora from behind her cheek against Nora's back. "Mama Nora," she said, not as a question, not as a test, as a name, as the truest available word for the thing Nora was to her. Nora set down the spoon. She covered Lily's hands with her own. She felt the tears come. Not the old kind, not the tired, defeated tears of a woman who has been wrong about everything and cannot see the way forward. These were different. These were the tears that come when the thing you stopped believing in has happened anyway, when Providence has turned out to be exactly as stubborn and patient as advertised. She did not try to stop them. She let them come, and she held Lily's hands against her middle, and she stood in her kitchen, in her house, in the life she had walked into, half frozen and half hopeless on a winter night a year ago. "Happy Christmas, sweetheart," she said. The back door opened. Cole came in from the barn with snow on his shoulders and his hat tipped with ice, and his face red from the cold. He stopped when he saw them, the two of them in the kitchen light, Lily attached to Nora's back, Nora's cheeks wet, and the whole room golden with firelight and the smell of everything good. He took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He looked at his daughter. He looked at his wife. He looked at the room that had been cold and functional and correct and had become, without his fully tracking the process, the center of everything. He crossed the kitchen. He put his arms around both of them, his cold coat against Nora's warm back, his chin coming down over Nora's head, his hand finding Lily's hair. Lily made a sound of pure contentment. Nora closed her eyes. She thought of the snow and the dark road, and the light she had walked toward without knowing what it was. She thought of a barn and a fire she had built to be safe in for one night. She thought of a child's fever breaking and boots repaired and left by the door, and shelves at exactly the right height, and a man who had ridden through the night to find a law that would keep her. She thought, "I walked through a storm to find this." She thought it was worth every step. Outside, the snow came down in the particular soft way of Christmas snow, quiet and unhurried, and covering everything equally, the fences and the fields, and the long road from town, covering the tracks of a gray gelding that had ridden away, and not come back, covering the cold places and the hard places, and all the evidence of difficult seasons. Inside, the fire burned. Lily laughed at something her father said, the full, bright laugh of a child who has forgotten to be careful with her happiness. Cole looked at Nora over the top of Lily's head, and his eyes said the thing that he had always said better, without words, than with them. She looked back at him. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke and apple and bread. The fire spoke in its low, steady voice. The snow came down outside and did not come in. She was home. She had been home for a long time. She had only just learned this morning that she was allowed to say so.